in the last few lessons, we've been talking about the introduction to socialism, looking at some of the main ideas of what socialism actually is, and looking at a number of different movements within the socialist tradition. And in this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to go into more detail at the development of socialism, look at how it has developed over the years, and we're going to do this by examining a number of key thinkers in this lesson. We're going to be focusing mainly on Marx and Engels, what they contributed to the socialist tradition, and then look at Rosa Luxemburg and how she contributed to the socialist tradition as well, before we look at socialist society and a number of other issues within the idea and the traditions of socialism in a couple of lessons' time. So let's begin by talking about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Now, Marx and Engels are arguably the founding fathers of the socialism and the socialist tradition that we now understand today. So don't forget, there were what existed these kind of utopian socialists and a number of socialist ideas and a socialist thought that were built upon older philosophical traditions. So, for example, the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau contributed heavily to a number of utopian socialist ideas. However, what we understand socialism to mean in this modern context, in the context as we understand it today, originates almost entirely from Marx and Engels over here. So they are arguably the founding fathers of the socialist tradition that we understand today. Okay, and they contributed extensively to both political economy and also to philosophy through a number of key works that are authored by both Marx and Engels, just Marx and just Engels in some areas. Okay, so one of them being the Communist Manifesto. That is arguably the bedrock the groundwork of what they proposed as a solution, as a normative expansion of what the worker and what society ought to be doing to achieve this revolution into socialism, into transitionary socialism, and then into a communist state. You also have works such as Das Kapital, which contributed as a critique of the modern political economy at the time, so the development of capitalism at the time, with works such as Adam Smith's and David Ricardo. Marx contributed this by critiquing their understanding of political economy. Equally, you've got a couple of works of historical materialism and later works by Marx. So, for example, the German Ideology talked a lot about historical materialism in a lot more detail. And also, Critique of the Gotha Programme was also one of Marx's later pieces. Now, in terms of their beliefs, we should note that in the Communist Manifesto, they argue that society and that the history of society is the, quote, history of class struggle. That is one of the first lines in the Communist Manifesto, if you were to ever read it. It's very short. And this places an emphasis on their understanding of historical materialism. And if you want to know more about historical materialism, check out our last lesson where we went into it a lot more detail, talking about historical materialism and a number of cross-cutting issues such as alienation and class consciousness, etc., etc. They argue that the existence of the state perpetuates the interests of whichever class has control of the means of production. And they argued in this case it was the bourgeois class, the owner class, who have control of the means of production. And so therefore the existence of the state doesn't seek to intervene and to support the interests of the workers, those who have to sell their labour for profit. Instead, it perpetuates the interests of those who own the means of production. So it perpetuates the interests of this relatively small owner class, this bourgeois owner class. And therefore this emphasizes the fact that Marx was not a statist. Marx was not a statist in any regard. He regarded that the state is something that would, quote-unquote, wither away, something we'll look at in a second. When it comes to other philosophical traditions, Marx and Engels referred to the concept of religion and the existence of religion in society as the quote-unquote opium of the people. Now, this is a quote that has been mischaracterized a lot by socialist traditions following Marx and Engels. And ultimately, all it refers to is that opium and religion serve the same kind of purpose in that they sedate society And whereas opium is a sedative and it is something that and a pain relief as well, it's also a painkiller. Religion acts in a similar way. It's also a pain relief. Okay. And it's a pain relief in the sense that it sedates society from realizing their material and their class struggles. It stops the pain of material and class consciousness and class struggle from ever perpetuating, just like opium does the same thing when you have pain. And then when it comes to the reform into a communist state, into a communist society, Marx and Engels set about thinking about how this would be achieved. They believed it would be inevitable, owing to their understanding of historical materialism, that inevitably this is something that would take place. They believed that a reform into a communist society would be done by a number of means, by a number of steps. So firstly, a worker revolution will take back the means of production. They will communally control the means of production. This is a transitionary socialist period whereby we have what is known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the dictatorship, again, as I referred to many times in these lessons, does not mean have the same kind of connotations as it does in today's common parlance, in the sense that dictatorship just simply means control or ultimate control. So the ultimate control of the means of production will lead to a dictatorship of the proletariat. And then eventually this transition into socialism and this transitionary period will lead us into a state, into a situation, if you will, which we would describe as communism, which would be a withering away of the class structure that exists and creating a classless society, and a society where the state will simply cease to be important, cease to be necessary in anything, because as we've already mentioned, Marx says that the state exists to perpetuate the interests of those who own the means of production. But if everybody owns the means of production and is communally owned, and there's no such thing as class and class struggle, then there's no need for the state to perpetuate and uphold the interest of a particular class, because there is no class. Therefore, the state shall, quote-unquote, wither away. When it comes to Rosa Luxemburg, there's been she adopted and reformed and talked about adding to a lot of the socialist tradition. She contributed a number of works to the socialist tradition, namely the book Reform and Revolution, and also the work The Mass Strike, the Political Party and the Trade Unions, all both very key works that contributed greatly to the socialist tradition. The most important thing that we can take away from Rosa Luxemburg's philosophy or her political economy is that she was very heavily critical of the idea of socialism through reform, the reformist understanding of socialism. So she was heavily critical of a reformist understanding of socialism, the idea that we can achieve socialism using reform, like legal reform and political reform, for example. She said that the only way to achieve quote-unquote worker emancipation is for there to be mass strike and worker revolution. So she took what Marx and Engels had said, that revolution is something that is required to achieve this dictatorship of the proletariat, and she emphasized that this even stronger. So she said that reform is nothing, has no way of being able to achieve a state of socialism. The only way we can achieve worker emancipation, the only way we can achieve this, is through mass strike and worker revolution. She said that striking and the existence of mass strikes of the workers provide a number of key utilities. So the first of them being that they bring the proletariat together in their class consciousness. So they develop a sense of camaraderie among the working class, and it allows the ability for the working class to realize their class consciousness, to realize their material struggles. And they also said that it helps educate the workers as to better develop and organize their worker movements. Ultimately, if you organize more and more mass strikes, you're going to be better at organizing worker movements and worker striking operations in the future. And again, finally, before we end, just emphasizing the fact that she argues that basic reform, legal reform, such as legal reform, or even political reform, or maybe even economic reform, all these things that we do in a liberal democracy like the one we're living in, none of these will ever achieve any kind of state of communism or socialism. They will never be able to achieve socialism. The only thing that can lead to this and can lead to this worker emancipation is the existence of mass strikes and worker revolution.